IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/PSW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter. Endgame automates the hunt for both known and never-before-seen adversaries in enterprise networks. Built on unique knowledge on the adversary's tools, techniques, and tactics, Endgame's centrally managed agent prevents, detects, and responds to advanced adversaries in the earliest stages of the kill chain without prior knowledge. Endgame. Automate the hunt. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. This is our security news for this week. I want to mention our fine friends at itpro.tv. Make sure you go to itpro.tv/Security Weekly. Give them a try as an individual and encourage your organization to subscribe to a team edition, which gives your entire IT organization access to over 3,300 hours worth of training. Make sure you go do that and attend Source Boston. Last week we interviewed Rob Shane. This week, Masha Sedona. Awesome content at Source Boston. We'll be there selling T-shirts. It's May 9th through the 10th. The discount code is
awesome T-shirts.
Awesome hack naked T-shirts that we have that will be selling at Source Boston, which you can purchase.
Really awesome.
Stickers are free, by the way. The discount code, if you want to attend Source Boston and get $75 off, SW75WMKW. Make sure you do that. Visit sourceconference.com. Are there any other announcements? We have a webcast with Distill Networks and a news article about bots, which is interesting. securityweekly.com/Distill Networks. If you want to hear from the folks that are absolutely, in my opinion, the authoritative source for bots as they relate to your web applications and security, Distill Networks. Rami Assad is just, Rami's awesome. Like there's a whole story there how we got hooked up with Distill Networks. It's a great story. We've told it on various shows. Basically, we covered it at Enterprise Security Weekly. We didn't understand what they did. I got on the phone with Rami. I was totally impressed, and I'm very happy to convey to our listeners today that we are working with Distill. And you should totally check out their products. So securityweekly.com/Distill Networks. April 25th, we'll be doing a webcast with them. Make sure you check it out. They're going to be talking about bad bots, good bots, how to tell the difference. To segue into one of our stories this week, there was a story that said Facebook and Twitter may be forced to identify bots. And I think as we think of bots, we tend to think of automated scripts that are creating accounts on social media networks that are very much bots for various purposes. Of course, we've seen many news articles about the Russian influence on the U.S. election and how bots play into that. And there is a California law, California of all places, being very innovative and creative with their laws today, whether you agree with them or not, has proposed a law that they've introduced a bill that would give, and I quote, online platforms such as Facebook and Twitter 3 days to investigate whether a given account is a bot, to disclose that it's a bot if it is in fact auto-generated, or to remove the bot outright. What do you guys think about this first story?
I was going to say, Paul, we should just pause and just think about the implications of that for a minute.
Okay.
Like a moment to consider that there's legislation that is challenging any entity, organization of determining whether an account is a bot or not. I mean, bots have been around a long time.
Yes.
Uh, and I don't know exactly when people started using them for uh, other than casual. I mean, we used to use bots 20 years ago just to, on IRC channels just to try to trick people into, they're talking to the bot, and, figure out how long it takes for them to figure out that they're not
Yeah.
talking to a real person type of thing.
You bring up a great point, Jeff. It's an oversubscribed term, and I think that the elephant in the room as it relates to sites like Facebook and Twitter and others is that their evaluation of their value as a company, evaluation of their revenue and growth is the number of subscribers, which is artificially inflated by the usage of a bot. If they're forced to do some analysis to determine who's a real person versus a bot. By the way, that's Distill is a sponsor of the network. They are one such company that I believe, in having spoken with and worked with very closely, is able to make a very informed decision as to whether or not your traffic is a human being or a bot. When you put that level of scrutiny on these large social media companies, it can have the potential to devalue them as a company because their user numbers are artificially inflated. Again, that's the elephant in the room. We all know that as
So
security
is that the
practitioners.
answer to my question of when did bots sort of start getting used for fun and profit, if you will, when social media companies started coming about and started basing their revenue streams on numbers of hits, numbers of users, numbers of followers? I mean, I'm asking the question. I don't
Yeah.
know the answer.
I think
When did
that's one.
bots?
I think that's one aspect, Jeff. Certainly. Now, there's certainly, to pivot into more of a security and technical discussion, there's a great benefit as an organization to determine, hey, is this traffic from a bot or is it from a real person? Huge security benefits there, obviously, right? Like if I can, first of all, I think the best use case is basically all this traffic doesn't really mean anything because it's from some automated bot. It's not an actual person. I can focus on who's an actual person coming to my site and focus my efforts on that, not on the auto-generated bot traffic. So I think the California legislation is interesting, as is much of the legislation that is proposed by not just states like California, but many different states. I think we hear of a lot of, I think, legislation that could have merit. I think also legislation that is extremely ridiculous. Forcing these large social media companies to disclose and put effort into getting rid of bots on their network is a very controversial subject, and one that warrants some discussion, certainly.
Well, I've got a comment, Paul. It seems like in the article and in the overall proposal that they're focusing on the wrong thing, because it's really not about the technology, right? I use bots. I use bots to retweet content that I find interesting, right? Because I'm too lazy to do it myself, right? But that's the wrong focus. I mean, are they not really, and I may be mistaken here, but are they not really going after the amplification of disingenuous information or fake news, as otherwise said?
No, it's a great distinction, Joff, right? Like, you are a person who has a social media account. You may use bots to contribute to your content, and you have to make the distinction between that, which is totally legitimate in my opinion, and accounts that are created by bots that are solely to manipulate the system or misrepresent information or statistics within your organization, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when I've seen legislation fail in my history, and the same goes, by the way, the exact same thing goes with IT policies in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
When I've seen it fail is when it is targeted too specifically at a technology or a perception of a technology.
Correct.
When legislation is written or policies are written such that they target a general concept that they're trying to get a hold of, regardless of the technological implementation, that's usually going to be much more successful.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, Jeff, and I think it probably has roots in case law and legislation for hundreds of years. We're just seeing it from a different perspective. But, my initial thought when you said, people write it too specifically, I'm thinking, yeah, and they don't really know what they're talking about. They don't understand the nuances and the complexities, just for like an example, how many different variations of things that are out there that sort of, fall into this category of bot, what we're calling a bot. So I would agree that I think the legislation needs to be necessarily, I guess, a little bit more cleverly generic. And then it comes down to good old-fashioned case law and somebody arguing this is why it should be interpreted the way we think it should be interpreted. But I think what's overarching fascinating about this discussion is the fact that and why there's sort of 2 points. Why there's legislation being proposed in the first place is because nothing is illegal until there's a law that says it's illegal, in a sense, and so there's kind of a need to put a stake in the sand and make a declaration. And I think maybe the rush to doing a specific or more granular proposal bill is an attempt to sort of jumpstart the system, because traditionally you put a law out there and it's sort of interpreted in the courts. It's how judges and the courts interpret the law that becomes the precedent for how it's enforced. And just quickly, another point is just because legislation's been proposed doesn't mean it's going to pass and become law. A couple years ago,
Jeff,
there was a big stink about notification after, I guess, the Target and the Home Depot breach, and companies being, there was bills put forth. The government's got to do something. All they came up with was notification. To my knowledge, I don't think they ever passed it.
Right. Yeah. And Jeff brings up a great point when we talk about laws that could affect cybersecurity, for lack of a better term. Right. There's in any different topic, right? There's a bunch of proposed bills, proposed laws, and only a certain percentage of those actually get passed. However, I don't want to discount the discussion that surrounds a proposed bill, because whether you're in favor of that, and I think it speaks to our system of government we have here in the U.S., right? Like whether you're in favor of that or opposed to that, it gives you a voice under free speech to voice your opinion and potentially influence whether or not you agree with that particular bill or not. So I think, Jeff, that's certainly a valid point, that while these bills are proposed, I like the fact that we talk about them, right? So you can voice your opinion and even write your Congress people or whoever legislator in your state to state your opinion of whether you agree upon that or not.
Looking at the actual legislation here, this wouldn't apply to most people. It actually specifies you have to have more than 50 million unique visitors a month. So I imagine that rules out a majority of, custom bot authors, if you will. And it's pretty specific about how the bot itself has to attempt to mislead the end user in that it being a not natural person.
And I think as the larger providers today that are of greatest concern for me, and we've seen a lot in recent news about how the larger providers could be manipulated and or take into their own hands the control of information. We've seen this with Facebook. We've seen this with YouTube in the news recently, that for me, the concern is, again, I go back to what I said probably 3 or 4 years ago, right? My concern in terms of privacy and freedom of speech, not so much an issue with the U.S. government. It's more of an issue as to how our content is regulated and how regulations affect the larger social media and content providers that exist today that we use to have a voice, and their opinions that are then enforced upon their users. And I hate to bring up the shooting at YouTube, right? But that's a very extreme incident, and I don't agree with what happened, and I wish everyone the best. I know there's still at least one person in critical condition, which is just terrible. But the underlying story is frustration from YouTube users that may or may not be censored. I think there's also similar frustrations in Facebook. And did they have some way to influence the election? And these are all issues that have a dotted line to security in our organizations, but also speak to kind of the system that we're put in today, where larger providers can decide what content is appropriate or not for them, which is an interesting point of discussion.
It's sort of security, and it's not. I think about it. It's security in the sense that in the old days, when I started doing, pen testing 25 years ago, most of what we were doing was exploiting features. We just knew little tricks of how stuff worked and how settings were set and how things were done. But I'm thinking, in terms of you're using the YouTube shooting as an example, and people, being very frustrated with censorship or having equal access and things like that. Again, without legislation, these companies can kind of do what they want. Again, I've been getting most of my news on conventional television media the last week, especially with Facebook. And Zuckerberg's heading to town. I live near DC.
Yep,
he's coming here in the next couple weeks. He has already gone on record as saying maybe it's time for there to be regulation for their type of company, which I think is inevitable. I think it's going to happen. What that regulation looks like you said, we do live in a society now where we can express our opinions, we can call our congressmen and represent elected representatives, and what's the coolest thing about this country is, you're not going to talk to your senator, but somebody's going to answer the phone and listen to you and write down what you say. And I've done various social action type of call your Congress activities in the past. Sure. And it's relatively few calls before they take that notepad and they walk over to the person and say, hey, we've got 6 or 8 people calling in saying this is a big deal, we should take a look at it. They act upon it. So it's a great opportunity now for our community to step in, and those of us that we think, and I think to a large degree it's true, we have a little bit, we've been talking about this for a long time, we've been aware of it for a long time, we're more aware, I think, of the nuances and the complexities. Speak up. Find a way to speak up, whether it's organized and somebody presents something and we all get behind it.
And along those lines, Jeff, I think that
let's speak up.
I've been kind of somewhat swayed in various industries that I've been in, specifically tobacco, and been very anti-legislation. Cory Doctorow came on the show a while back and kind of said, yeah, like some may not make sense to you, and that's your opinion, and you're entitled to it, but there's a lot of legislation that really helps protect people and helps foster innovation and technology in a fair way. And it's very much a double-edged sword. And I think that's one of the great things about our country, right, is that we can all have a voice. We have freedom of speech. We can, as Jeff said, have the discussion with those in influence and make our opinions known, which I think is very important. But I think if you go back in our archives and you listen to Cory Doctorow, regardless of your viewpoints on legislation, I guarantee that when you listen to Cory, you're going to gain a lot of knowledge and information and perhaps sway your viewpoints as to legislation that makes sense, legislation that doesn't, and not kind of lump all legislation and government interaction into the bad category. And that's really what that interview with Cory did for me.
Yeah, can I make
real quickly, and then I'll let you jump in. Or if you don't want to find Cory Doctorow, just find Education Rock and listen to I Am a Bill. You can find it on YouTube.
Awesome.
Schoolhouse Rock. And it explains the process really well, and it's in a catchy tune.
Nice. Josh?
So my last comment here, in this specific example that we were talking about in this story, I think the focus should be on the concept of amplification of disinformation.
Yeah.
Not on the technology itself.
I think that's a really important distinction, as this could easily have a chilling effect. If it's no longer feasible for an organization, say, like Twitter, like Facebook, to respond within the time frame allotted, which is specified as 3 days, if they get hundreds of thousands of requests to view these particular bots and have to then submit a report on each one of them in aggregate, would it make more sense financially to just say, well, you can't talk about these certain topics?
Yeah.
And because it's no longer scalable. And this is the same argument that YouTube has been having for a long time. And most organizations that have a large internet presence that allow you to upload things is, how do you police your own content? And are you responsible for what users upload?
Well, and I think that's a key word
and
there.
That's a variation. If you want to take it that way, that's another form of censorship. If you're making it so it's not even worth it for us to regulate this content, let's just drop it. That's in effect a form of censorship.
Yeah, I think feasibility and responsibility are two huge concepts that play into this, and certainly, I don't think we're going to figure it out here on this show, but it's very interesting things to consider for our audience, especially given recent events in censorship of various forms of content. I know that when I found it very, almost kind of disturbing that, and very ironic that YouTube had an outage before there was a shooting on their campus. From everything I've said, that they're or observed, they're completely unrelated. But there was a time, day before yesterday, I believe, right, where YouTube was having service outages, and I thought, because I was trying to go to our channel for a very specific reason, which is a whole other story. Ask me about it at a beer at a conference, but I was going to our channel for a reason, and I wasn't able to get to our channel. My first thought was, oh my God, we're distributing hacking information, therefore we're being censored by YouTube. And then I started to poll the staff here at Security Weekly. I'm like, can you get to the channel? Can you get it? Some people could, some people couldn't. And I'm like, all right, let's check Twitter. Right, that was my gauge. Let's check Twitter. And when you searched on Twitter for YouTube, there's like 8 million tweets already in the first 10 minutes of YouTube experiencing trouble, of people going, hey, is anyone else having trouble getting to YouTube? And then I'm like, okay, it's a YouTube problem. We wait till the next day. Everything's fine. And I find our channel is in good standing, which is good. I was happy. I also called into question, what if, and this has happened in the past, what if YouTube deems our content as something that they don't want on their website? What do we do then? What if we get lumped into some arbitrary category of you're disseminating hacking information, or you've got hack naked as your mantra, and that violates our policies? What do we do then? And it begs,
maybe the question isn't if, but when that happens.
It's when.
What do we do?
What do we do? I know many content providers are going to YouPorn. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago on the show.
Yep.
Maybe that's an option for us. Who knows? But anyway, let's talk about some different stories. Moving on. Intel. I thought this was a very interesting move from Intel, and I want to get your thoughts on this. The Core 2 processors are no longer scheduled to receive updates. And while some first-generation Core products have microcode updates available already, others have had their update canceled. Now, I thought Core and then Core 2, like Core came first, Core 2 came second, and Core is going to receive some updates, but Core 2 processors aren't. Like, Intel's kind of arbitrarily saying, these processors get updates, but these ones don't. And it's totally up to them. So you could very well be stuck with a processor architecture that is not benefiting from patches that affect from the Spectre vulnerabilities.
I doubt very highly it's arbitrary. It's highly likely there's been a cost benefit analysis performed.
Sure.
And they have decided this is where they're drawing the line. It's no longer cost effective based on whatever they are projecting to have to do, fight, legal battles, getting sued, losing customers, whatever it is, they've drawn the line somewhere because they've done
business risk
analysis.
Right? Yeah, business risk or risk in general, right?
It's right in
straight
line
up
with
risk.
Jeff.
Business
Yeah,
risk.
I'm right in line with Jeff. This is totally business. And probably what factors into that is potential profit from upgrades. I mean, they're doing the math, right? Overall.
Yeah, they know that a certain percentage of people and organizations are going to be like, well, the risk is too great. We need to upgrade our processors, and that potentially means increased sales for companies like Intel.
Yeah, but again, this is a variation on a theme. I mean, I remember years ago, and I think it's still true today. I pen test a company, tell them about all these vulnerabilities we discovered, and they would have to. They're like, well, we're using some vendor's product, we're using some vendor's operating system, whatever it was. The excuse was we got to go back to the vendor, and they were kind of waiting to hear from the vendor. They couldn't do anything until the vendor said it was cool, or all the vulnerabilities in the operating system, but to upgrade, install the patch breaks the application, whatever it is. Again, it's a cost benefit analysis. It's risk. Who's banging the gong the loudest, who's making the most noise, who's got the biggest purse strings that can influence and make the changes. This is business. This is the reality of the business world we live in.
Looking at their
Go ahead, Kevin.
They have a list of affected processors and ones they're releasing updates for or not for all their lines. And some of the rationale for not updating I find very interesting. Some make sense, such as they can't do it. Micro-architectural characteristics that preclude a practical implementation. Well, one that really catches my eye here is based on customer inputs, most of these products are implemented as closed systems and therefore have an expected lower likelihood of exposure. And for some reason, they've air-quoted closed systems, which just makes me immediately think of ICS systems. And that we all know that they're not actually closed. They're found on the internet quite often.
Right. I like the quotes. There's actually a retail shop downstairs from us, and I forgot to tell everyone that I saw this. And on their sign, they said, "Hey, we'll be closed on Easter Sunday," and they enclosed Easter Sunday in double quotes. I'm like,
what do you mean?
I don't know if that's the right usage of the double quotes, but that's just kind of weird. Anyway.
Well, I really hope the rationale here is not that it's ICS or SCADA systems that have core CPUs in them, and that they're saying just because they're on isolated networks means they won't be attacked as for products.
It's one of those things, and I know we were talking during the break about how not a lot of things have changed in our industry, and I think one of those constants are organizations that have procured technology that is extremely volatile when it comes to updating the operating system. And I just hope that there are a lot more examples of organizations either developing their own software or finding software that is more resilient to upgrades. We've been talking about this problem. I encountered this problem when we first started the show, almost 14 years ago. And I hope today that we can at least start to overcome this issue of legacy technology and being stuck on legacy technology because the software that we bought is tied to legacy technology and is not resilient enough to be upgraded during that process. I think that's a huge problem in our industry still today that I think is totally solvable, but we haven't seen those solutions permeate throughout much of our infrastructure today. Well,
why? The question is why.
Jeff, you disagree. Why?
Well, again, it goes down to economics and supply and demand, and what's the economic value in upgrading. I think we've talked about it before too. We're living in a time now where we're expected to get a new mobile device, cell phone. What is it? Every year, 18 months. Because
it's true. I have a Google.
We got to get the latest and greatest.
I have a Google Pixel, and I'm like,
and my parents, we wanted to buy an appliance or a piece of, some sort of electrical device, even a freaking light bulb, and we want it to last for as long as possible and not have to replace it every little bit. So, still to this day, I think most managers and decision makers are still on the older side. They probably still have some recollection of, this time in our history where we bought things to last, not we bought things to replace every 12 or 18 months.
But I think there's a difference between hardware and software. I want to buy software that is resilient and understand that I will have to continually update that software, that there will be new updates to that software, and it's not necessarily tied to a physical appliance. Sure, I can buy a dishwasher for my house and expect it's going to last 30 years, but when I go to a software provider, and I'm totally cool with paying a maintenance fee year over year, if I want that software to last 30 years, I got to have an expectation that there are going to be new versions that are produced every single day, perhaps, that will keep up with my hardware changes, with my operating system changes, with my platform changes, that will work. And I hope that that's the new
depends on the
expectation.
industry. I mean, you used to work for who that and did OS 4690s or whatever they are.
I did 4690. I'm glad you mentioned that. Wow, I haven't heard
Why-
the term.
why were there so
IBM
many
4690
grocery stores?
operating system. Sure, that's a great
Why were
example.
so many grocery stores using it?
Yeah.
I mean, in the years that I was doing PCI, it was very common to see
Sure.
OS 4690s out there because they were
Wait, drink.
worked, they were stable.
Right.
Drink. Jeff mentioned PCI. Everybody, drink. Ready? Drink. Okay. Not Kevin.
Keep
He's got
talking PCI as
empty.
long as it's relevant to the conversation. Damn
Well,
it.
let's talk about healthcare devices. And there are some code execution vulnerabilities in some medical devices from Natus, and they are in EEG, what they call an offering described as like a leading edge features that you want in critical care. They include amplifier ports compatible with USB and TCP/IP cables, while neural network software connects to monitoring equipment to record data in SQL databases. There was a team at, I believe this was Cisco Talos, that discovered these vulnerabilities and disclosed them. Again, nothing new. We've seen a lot of these devices compromised in the past, and we can only hope, I think, as we talk about vulnerabilities in numerous systems, that organizations are more resilient to patching them, healthcare being at a significant disadvantage, I think, in this arena for a lot of reasons, patient care being probably the number one cause.
Well, life issues always exceed patching issues, right? But is that leading edge or is that bleeding edge?
It
Just
said
wondering.
leading. I was quoting the article. It does say leading dash edge features you want in critical care. I quoted that
Right.
purposely.
So I think the one thing that would bother me with EEG, of course, would be inaccurate, incorrect readout. So that would be awful, obviously, because there may be somebody's life in the hands of those results.
Yeah, and
but,
certainly I can, relate to that. Heart disease running in my family. I've had a lot of those similar kind of tests. The accuracy of those tests is extremely important to patient care. But I want to go back to KT's interview when we talked about risk not just being associated with security, not just associated with business or financial, but risk being risk. This needs to be in the equation for the companies that provide the software and the companies that are using the software and or hardware. Having accurate results speaks to the risk. Doesn't matter if it's business, financial, or security. It speaks to the risk.
Yeah, absolutely true. And there's a lot of, I hear a lot, especially in the healthcare industry and others. I hear a lot of the oh wait, but it's an air-gapped network kind of excuse. And of course, we all know in the industry that an air-gapped network is just a high latency network. And eventually, and unfortunately, an air-gapped network usually ends up being connected to a real network and is no longer air-gapped. So these things are very, very real. How many gin and tonics have I had? They're very real, right? And so they have to be taken care of. But I think I digressed. I'm sure Jeff has some awesome comments on this.
No, I'll let all that slide.
And sorry, I did misspeak. Heart disease. The EEG is an electrocephalography, if I can say that right.
It's a brain scan.
Brain scan. Thank you very much.
We're gonna let that slide.
You were letting that slide. I wasn't letting it slide because my shit detector of my own.
The next story after that massive
self-correction is okay. That's perfect.
Electroencephalography exam. Yes.
Well, it still applies, right? Any inaccurate result.
Any inaccurate result. Brain scan, a heart, whatever you're testing. Any kind of diagnostic test, certainly.
Because
I will
medical
say this. Sorry, John. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
All right, I'll go ahead. When we're thinking air gap networks and they're not, I at least sort of immediately jump to industrial control systems. I am not as familiar with networks in healthcare facilities to know whether they're truly air gapped or not. They probably aren't as air gapped as we think they are. I agree with that statement, but maybe it's a different kind of not air gapped. Maybe it's more of a proximity thing because there's wireless all over the place. I know when I've gone to various hospitals and clinics, most recently when I go visit my daughter when she's had a grandchild, and they've got a workstation next to her bed, and it's logged in, and I'm looking at not only my daughter's record and what's supposed to be going with her, but a few clicks, and I'm looking at everybody on the floor. I mean, it's a closed network. It's a network within the building. I don't know if it's internet reachable or not, but I could certainly look at a lot of different things. And I think, I didn't read this article, but just looking at the short write-up, is this a remote attack, or it's talking about USB and TCP/IP cables? Is this a proximity attack?
Some of those are network and remote. If you start reading into the CVEs, so I think it's a combination of a few different, but some of them are over the network, which that's worst case scenario.
It's interesting when I tell people about my background in having worked for universities. They're like, oh, that's some of the hardest environments to secure. Over the years, when we've talked about healthcare, I think it's right up there and almost, I think, kind of goes above the university network because, as all of us on the show have started to share stories about when you're in the hospital, whether it's your spouse or someone in your family that's just had a baby or someone in your family is sick. I was in the hospital this week because my dad was in the hospital, and I mean, you walk into the hospital and you sit in the patient's room, and there are Ethernet ports available. There's wireless networks available. As Jeff said, there may be a terminal in the room, and someone may have let themselves logged in. That's particularly concerning, Jeff. My wife actually works in a medical facility, and every activity is traced back to the person who is logged in. In other words, for HIPAA, for example, accessing other people's information in their healthcare records is very much frowned upon, and more so today, logged, and action taken if, let's say, you're working in a environment where whatever your qualifications are, it could be nurse, medical imaging, doctor, whatever. If you're looking into a case that you shouldn't be, that you haven't had involvement in, maybe you're looking it up for a family member or a friend, that's most certainly a HIPAA violation, and the medical community has, and medical organizations, healthcare organizations, have certainly cracked down upon in recent years. So, Jeff, your story is the most concerning for me, other than the kind of secondary risk of trying to gain unauthorized access to that. So there's a lot of issues that play into just the general workings of a healthcare organization, let alone in this case when devices have vulnerabilities that, as Kevin was pointing out, are available over the network.
So let me ask you a question, and it's a loaded question, but I'll try to make it an open-ended question. Why, and this is for anybody, why is the healthcare community, why is security so hard to do in that particular vertical?
Oh, that's easy. Okay.
It's patient care. I think I know where Joff is going to go with this, right? It's patient care. Masha talked about how do we get people in our organization to care about security. That can tie into their job. In healthcare, your job very much so, and I think in an emotional and psychological aspect, is making sure your patient doesn't die. And that like trumps everything. So if security gets in the way of that, even in kind of like a dotted line fashion, you're still going to favor that patient care. Joff, sorry.
So how much? Well, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I exactly agree with that. I think the human life issue completely overrides everything else, and rightfully so. And so it's a challenge to the information security community to come up with creative solutions that do not get in the way of the human life issue, which is real, right? I mean, people have got to survive, right? That's the number one thing,
right? That
the doctors are there. But secondary to that, which is what makes it similar to university environments, it's what I call the issue of 1,000 bosses. Every doctor thinks that they know the answer, just like every university professor feels like they know the answer because they're well-educated people and they have largely run their own independent businesses, and they feel like they're the boss and they should be able to exert that authority over the hospital or over the university correspondingly, right? So there's a culture and a mentality that goes along with it, along with the life safety issue. So I also agree with Paul's earlier statement that universities don't actually are not as hard to secure as medical environments. And the ultimate kingpin here is a public teaching university, which is medical.
Yeah.
Then you've got both of these things combined. Which becomes an incredibly difficult challenge. And so I think it's a challenge that we have to get creative about.
And I will say, Joff, to support that many universities in the New England area that I've worked with that also have medical programs, to speak to your description, also have IT staff and security staff dedicated to that as well. And I think that even all the issues we've pointed out, they're very cognizant of that issue and attempt to apply IT procedures and security procedures to the medical portion of that university. So
they do. And look, Paul, I would love to get. I don't know if this is possible, but if Paul, and forgive me for doing this, but I'm going to do it. If
put me on the spot, Jeff. It's okay. It's okay.
if there is a chief information security officer or similarly level position person that would like to come on the show
I know where you're
talk
going.
with us about those challenges, I really would love to hear it.
We can do that.
Now, teaching university perspective.
I left the university space working for a university in 2007, leaving university and nonprofit altogether in 2008. So, roughly 10 years ago. However, we still maintain contacts in that area. So, a CISO of a medical school, for example, would be a great, interview on our network. Yeah, I agree. I see where you're going with that. I like
that.
It
would be cool because my follow-up question to my initial question was going to be, how much of it is this issue of they're hard to secure a technical problem versus a perception problem?
Yeah,
or political problem, which relates to perception, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right,
because I think we've all had experiences where, we have failed at getting the message across that no, really, we're not going to break anything. No, really, it's okay. No, we can't even risk it. We're not even entertaining the thought because of the perceived what could go wrong. It's a risk equation thing, but I think that happens in the medical community a lot.
I want to pivot to a story that I know that recently I've read the Phoenix Project and am about halfway through Beyond the Phoenix Project, and I know people already maybe like, Paul, all right, like give it a rest. We understand you read these books, but I read a story recently that was titled "How Security Can Bridge the Chasm with Development," and certainly we've talked about these issues in the past about how security interacts with development, how IT interacts with development and security. One of the realizations that I've come to recently And I'm almost kind of disheartened that it's taken me this long to come to what I believe is this level of understanding of the interactions between these groups. Is that really, for me, what I've understood, and it really wasn't even so, interviewing people on DevOps and reading some of the works from Gene Kim and John Willis and George Spafford and others, but listening to Beyond the Phoenix Project really helped me understand that at its core, addressing this specific issue of how does security interact with development, right? That there's a kind of different level of thinking that development and IT and operations and security operate as a cohesive unit, such that we're deploying applications with infrastructure, with security applied to that as part of the DevOps process, and that all three groups working together can really deploy applications with the highest level of success. It kind of makes me think articles like this are somewhat antiquated when we talk about, well, like, hey, you should go out and have beers with your dev team and stuff. I'm like, to me, recently I've realized it's much deeper than that, that we're deploying technology together as a team, as one cohesive unit, borrowing from concepts from, and where I was going with the interview with Masha, right, was we're borrowing concepts from other industries, in this case manufacturing, to be able to do that seamlessly is really exciting for me. And I think that we've seen this progression from like as far back as perhaps 2003. Several of the works that I've seen referenced took place from the 1950s all the way to the 1990s, and people like Gene Kim and John Willis and others have taken those works, applied those to software and how it's developed, to really, I think, combat many of these problems that were like, developers don't understand security. Well, we all need to work together, and if we do, it's just part of the process. And so I thought this article was interesting in that it represents the older way of thinking, how we interact. It's not so much an interaction as it is we're pushing things out together. And all these components, good software, good development practices, good infrastructure from IT, and good security practices all get rolled into the software that's getting rolled out. And I think many organizations have adopted these processes. We talk about Etsy, we talk about Netflix, and many other organizations. They've done it well. And I want to see that permeate out into what we were talking about before, universities, healthcare, and many other organizations, which I still think are lagging behind in this DevOps process. So over to the group for thoughts, comments.
So my initial thought is tying back to our interview with Masha. What of these companies that you're citing is doing it successfully? What have they done to motivate their developers and others to work well together and make it all function? And has that happened? Or is there something else going on? What is the secret of their success, if you will?
Yeah.
And does it tie in any way to what Masha was talking about in her segment?
It does, in a slightly different way that we didn't cover in the interview, that I think kind of speaks to some of the business works that I've been reading and philosophies that I've been subscribing to as part of our Business Security Weekly program. And that, as a company, you need to define your one problem and your one solution and your one category and go with it. And by the way, if you've got people in your organization that aren't on board with that process, that's toxic to the environment, that could potentially undermine the whole thing. When I look at the DevOps process and how you implement that and how it involves support from all the different groups in your organization, it's very much the same thing. I have to identify people who are going to support that process, and those that don't, maybe not a great fit for our organization. And that's a very difficult thing and a difficult concept for us to implement in business, as we don't want to isolate people or identify those that may be toxic to our environment and get rid of them. But it's very critical to that process, both in defining your category, defining your mission as an organization, and also defining your processes as to how you develop software.
I just have a couple of comments. One is, I do believe talented developers are hungry to connect with talented information security professionals and really learn from each other, because developers are, unlike our end users, developers are well aware of the ramifications and implications of mistakes here, I believe. It's too public now, and they're absolutely, in the know. We just need to actually reach out and form those connections, and I think we can have very, very positive impact in that respect. And then the other comment I have is, any development shop has to include security in their security development, in their software development lifecycle, and not all of them do. And it's unfortunate if that's the case, because the ones that don't are coming at it from a post-release perspective. The ones that do are coming at it from we have this in the cycle. We've already cleared some security hurdles before we go to initial release.
Yeah, and I think, Caleb talks about in his article on Dark Reading how we need to keep it simple, how we need to not rely on the OWASP top 10 as it's an external standard that's trying to implement security controls. And I think what really kind of trumps all of these different items in his article is that security is built in from the beginning. And I think it's a completely different take on that. I think we thought about, we'll get in the early meetings when they're developing software and we'll inject security into that process. And in thinking of that as a one-time thing, I'm going to insert myself in the beginning of the process, is just the tip of the iceberg. Security needs to be part of the process, not just in the beginning, the middle, or the end, but on a continual basis as we deploy software. Let's think about, okay, we're not going to have one software deployment every 6 months. We're going to have 10 deployments a day. And those smaller batch processes, how are we continually injecting security into that process? How are we testing our code, not just for functionality, but also security, and continually making improvements and having that push forward notion that we have developed from DevOps? I think it's a very different way of thinking than we've had in the past. I think that DevOps kind of embodies a whole new culture that allows us to operate more efficiently. And efficiency doesn't just mean it's reliable, it also means it's secure as well.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's more important than ever in the world of DevOps to make sure that security is firmly embedded in that cycle, right? In that process release cycle, because if it's not, then you're going to end up putting stuff out there that's just vulnerable, and we don't want to see that. That's a negative result overall.
It's
and
the best
definitely
example.
Don't want to come in post release.
Right. It's the best example of security being part of the process.
Absolutely.
Along those lines, we're trying to get Gene Kim to come on the show as in this. I didn't realize the Phoenix Project has paid homage to a book by Dr. Goldratt called The Goal. And Dr. Goldratt wrote The Goal, and they very much mirrored that in the Phoenix Project. And what I didn't realize, and I think a lot of our listeners don't realize, is that Dr. Goldratt released what was called Beyond the Goal, which was kind of like his insights and thoughts, I want to say 10 or 15 years later after he wrote the original book, The Goal, about the whole like lean development and constraints-based approach to implementing a process, what we call the value chain. Now, Gene Kim and John Willis released Beyond the Phoenix Project as an homage to Beyond the Goal. So like they're following what has happened before with the concepts of lean manufacturing and taking those into the DevOps process. Listening to Beyond the Phoenix Project, if you've read the Phoenix Project, go download or read or however you consume your books beyond the Phoenix Project, because it makes you think about and really clarifies a lot of the messages that are in the original book, The Phoenix Project, and realize that they're doing that not just because they thought of it as some new idea, but they're following a model that borrows from another industry, which I thought was really cool. And people may call it copying. It's not. It's an application of a process to what we do today in development and security and IT operations, that is paying homage to a process that's been known to work for some time, which I thought was really cool.
Well, I would just double down on that. First of all, to say that every IT security professional, in my opinion, should read the Phoenix Project.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely a reminder that you do not stand alone in the information security industry.
Now,
and
what's interesting, Joff, is that Gene and John will talk about the order in which you should read these. They actually recommend you read the goal and then the Phoenix Project. Now,
oh, that's interesting. Yeah,
I didn't get to that point until after I had read the Phoenix Project, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to go back and read the goal. And I'm doing a reverse order, but their recommendation is to read the goal, read the Phoenix Project, then, you know, and explore the other works of not just Dr. Goldratt, but Deming as well, which they talk about and Beyond the Phoenix Project, and the work at Toyota. Like, there's just some great insights in these works, and it gets your gears turning as to how you can apply all of this stuff to your work today, whether you're working in DevOps or IT operations or both. So it's pretty cool stuff. It's kind of been a thing that I've been going through lately, and I even more hold respect for those doing those works in manufacturing as well as in DevOps today. So it's really cool stuff. Couple other news items. Did you guys see the Cloudflare has made a huge press release? It's been in all over the news that I've been following, that they have a new DNS service which is implementing DNS over HTTPS and bringing forth to the public today a new DNS service which provides, I think, reliability in addition to security and privacy in their DNS service. Do you guys see that?
I did. I'm so geeky. I was just like, wow, Cloudflare scoring 1.1.1.1.
Right, yeah.
Like, that is fantastic. That was
Joff and I share kind of that network geekery kind of component, yeah. Right? And, working for the university and looking at address space and what was allocated to the university that I worked for, and realizing we owned more than we were actually using, and how address space was allocated, and like who got 1.1.1, like that .1, like that's really cool. So for them to use that particular IP address for those, I guess, internet nerds, TCP/IP nerds, like that's really cool. First of all,
yeah. Well, that was my first reaction, but the other idea, of course, with secure DNS and being able to perform adequate DNS response filtering and so forth, I think that's really, really cool. For some organizations, that's really a big value add. So that combined with the idea of 1.1.1.1 is, a nice combination. Very easy for the sysadmins to remember and get it configured and all the rest of it. So
I love that we're still talking about DNS in the security context and being nerds still today. Like, those that have listened to the show for a while know that, like, I've been like the DNS person at so many different organizations, right? And for us still to be talking about it to this day, being sponsored by Domain Tools, as an example, we just did a webcast with them yesterday, and talking about investigations into IPs and domain names. How that's still relevant today is just totally amazing to me. Totally amazing. How I'm still, my pet project today is trying to get my DNS logs into Security Onion, for example, which I hope to be a future technical segment here on the show. It's just fascinating that it's been that one constant through my career that I've had to study, I've had to analyze and implement projects in DNS. And for the headlines today be Cloudflare in 1.1.1.1 is just pretty cool.
I have a silly question.
Yeah.
Because I haven't looked at TCP/IP addressing in quite a while. Isn't 1.1.1.1? Maybe I should just say, what is it? Why is it so special? Because I would have thought that it was in reserved address space.
It could have been at one time, Jeff. It's a very good observation. There are many Class A's and different, CIDR block notations that fall into that kind of like reserved space that have come back into circulation for others to purchase as IPv4 space has become somewhat of a commodity today, certainly.
Right.
So, some of those CIDR blocks, especially the Class A's in the lower numbers, are very much coveted and typically were allocated to very early organizations, being universities and ISPs, several, I'm talking 20 plus years ago, that have maybe come back into circulation and now permeate today in 1.1.1.1, for example. So that in and of itself is fascinating because of the way address space was allocated 20 or 30 years ago and has been reallocated today.
I used to pen test 20 years ago, and back in those days, one of the challenges when you were sort of trying to identify your targets and trying to figure out, what the address space was of who your customer was. They were always a customer. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Looking up their address space, seeing what back in the early days, did they buy a Class C? Did they have more than one Class C? What did they own in terms of domain space and address space? And that was part of the reconnaissance that we used to do. And I might have. I'll have to look in some of my archives to see if I have old records of what the addressing looked like back 20 years ago, because some people might find that interesting.
Yeah. 1.1.1.1, by the way, is part of Asia Pacific, Nick. I noticed it's Australian run, but obviously Cloudflare has cut a deal, which is awesome to make this happen. So that's fantastic. Hey, Paul, I was just wondering, we might want to wrap. It's getting late.
Holy crap! It's almost 9 o'clock.
Yeah, it is.
Any other stories? VirusTotal has launched a sandbox for Android. I thought it was kind of interesting to compete with. What's the other service that allows you to analyze Android? Cuckoo. Yes, Cuckoo Sandbox. Cuckoo Sandbox allows you to analyze Android apps, and now VirusTotal is throwing their hat in the ring for that level of analysis.
Very cool.
Other than that, I think that rounds out security news for this week and Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone for listening and watching. Joff, are you going to take us out?
I am. I'm going to take us out. Paul, that's a lovely lavender shirt. Over and out.